Our webinar today is about the active power control options in Huawei solutions. So in some areas, network operators restrict power control on the grid connection point. And this for ensuring higher safety and higher stability of these grid connection network operators. So Huawei actually provide active power limitation options, whether based on unlimited power or zero export or limited power at the grid connection. For power export limitation, Huawei device, which is a smart power sensor, will be used and installed in the grid connection point. The smart power sensor will be observing and monitoring the output of the consumption of the load and sending signals to control and regulate the inverter output. The power meter is designed for real-time measurements for parameters such as the active and reactive power, frequency, phase voltages, and currents. In the first scenario, we can see that this actually is compatible whether if you're using a single inverter, if you are using multiple inverters with a smart dongle, WLAN or FE or 4G, and multiple inverters with a smart plugger. So we have the closed loop control response time. This is the time between observing this power output from the inverter. If it was higher than the load, then within 2 seconds, the inverter will be sent signals to reduce the power output. And this is in the single inverter case. While in the multiple inverters case with the WLAN FE or 4G dongle, it will be done within 5 seconds. And for multiple inverters with a smart logger, the response time is within 2 seconds. With a single inverter, the closed loop controller will be the inverter directly. So the power sensor will be connected to the inverter directly. With multiple inverters, it can be connected to a master inverter with the WLAN FE or 4G dongle for communication. And multiple inverters with smart logger, our controller will be the smart logger itself. So the inverters will be connected to the smart logger at one COM port, and the power sensor will be connected to the smart logger on a separate COM port. The requirements of the meter for this function will be to have a refresh delay time within less than 0.25 seconds, sampling accuracy less than 1%, communication with the Modbus RTU protocol that's using the RS-485 communication cable. We have Huawei available meters of 2 types, the single phase and the 3-phase. So we have the DDSU 666H single phase meter for the single phase inverters and applications. And we have the DTSU 666H 250 amps over 50 milliamps for the 3-phase inverters and 3-phase scenarios. And then we also have a compatible list of third-party power meters verified by Huawei and managed by Huawei whitelist. The number of connected devices in the single inverter scenario, it will be 1 inverter, and multiple inverters with a 4G dongle and the WLAN, it will be 2 to 10 inverters. And with the multiple inverters with a smart logger, it can be up to 80 devices. So here we have the supported inverter models in the single inverter and multiple inverters with a smart dongle, WLAN and FE and 4G that will be compatible with the smart power sensor. One of them will be the master, where we will connect the power sensor. And in case we have multiple, in case of the multiple inverters, the WLAN FE or the 4G dongle should be connected to the same master inverter. In the multiple inverter scenario with a smart logger, we have here the compatible list of inverters. The system commissioning and control will be done with the FusionSolar application. In case of the single inverter, it will be connected directly to the inverter. In case of the multiple inverters, it will be connected to the master inverter. And in case of the multiple inverters with the smart logger, it will be connected to the smart logger where it will be the master unit. Here we have the first scenario with one unit of single phase inverter. So for one unit, the inverter will be connected directly with the smart power sensor. So the smart power sensor will be connected in the grid, load to grid connection point. So it will be connected to the voltage lines of the incomer from the grid side. And the power sensor comes with current transformers already included in the package. The current transformers should be installed and clipped to the voltage lines and the grid connection point and should be facing the upward toward the load direction. So the power sensor will be detecting and observing the load consumption and sending RS-485 communication signals to the inverter to directly regulate and reduce the output and meet the load consumption requirement. We will use the single phase power sensor for the single phase inverters and the three-phase power sensor, as we can see here, for the three-phase inverters. For the communication purposes, we can use the WLAN FE dongle or the 4G dongle. Here we can see the list of the compatible inverters. And we have for the WLAN FE dongle from 3 up to 20 KTL. For the 4G dongle from 3 up to 100 KTL, we can see the compatible devices. Same scenario will be applied here. The voltage lines will be connected to the terminals of the power sensor, and the current transformers will be installed on the grid connection point voltage lines to observe the load consumption and therefore send signals to the inverter to regulate the output. The power sensor comes already with the CTs, current transformers, 3 of them for the three-phase power sensor and 1 for the single-phase power sensor, and it also includes the RS-485 communication cable. In case of having multiple inverters with dongle, we can have connected up to 10 devices. So the master unit will have the dongle installed and it shall be connected to the smart power sensor. The remaining inverters will be connected with daisy chains of RS-485 communication cables. So once the signals is sent to the first inverter, the signals will also be sent to the remaining inverters with the RS-485 communication cable. The recommended meter, which is the DTSU 666H for the three-phase scenarios, have a maximum current range of 250 amps for the primary current and 50 milliamps for the secondary current. If the system scenario or application is more than 170 kilowatt, which is equivalent to the 250 amps current, then we recommend to use third-party power meters at the grid connection point, which will have higher current ranges and for measurements. In case of multi-inverters installation with smart logger, the smart logger can accommodate up to 80 inverters. So these 80 inverters we will have 3 COM ports for the smart loggers. So the inverters should be accommodated in a separate COM ports, and the power sensor will be in an individual COM port. The master unit here will be the smart logger. The smart logger will be getting the data from the inverters and sending signals through the power sensor back to the inverters to regulate the power output. Please note that we will also send the slides after the event. Everyone who is registered will get an email with the slides for the full technical presentation. So for systems below 170 kilowatt, which is reflecting 250 amps of current, we can use the DTSU666H 250 amps over 50 milliamps from Huawei. For bigger systems with higher input current range, we can use the third-party approved power meters by Huawei. So for commissioning the power sensor, it can be done using the FusionSolar application. Once the inverter is installed, during the commissioning, once you click on the quick settings, there's an auto detection section. So the power sensor can appear there. You can click on the power sensor and click commission or configure with the inverter. Otherwise, it can also be added manually with the FusionSolar application. So basically, the inverter is being commissioned by the FusionSolar app by scanning the barcode of the inverter, the QR code or the serial number. During the quick settings, we can auto-detect the power sensor. If it's not detected, then we go to maintenance. In the maintenance, there's an option to add and delete devices. So we can add the device and click power meter, add the device, select the type of the device, and of course, this scenario, we have to have the power meter connected to the inverters, whether through the master inverter in multiple inverters scenario with the dongle, or through direct connection to the inverter, or using the smart logger. So the inverter can actually auto-detect the power sensor. Once the power sensor is added manually, we can insert and select the power sensor type, single phase or 3-phase, and typically the communication address is 11. For setting the power export control using the FusionSolar app, we can go to power adjustment in the home page, click on the option, and then click on grid point control. Grid point control, the application will ask you for the installer password, which is 5 zeros small a, and then click on the active power. Then click on set power export control mode and parameters, and then we will see the 3 available options. The first option is the unlimited mode. The unlimited mode, that means that the inverter is not restricted to any output power, and the generation is not limited. So the inverter can export the unlimited power back to the grid. In case of the zero export, then we will click on the option grid connection with zero export. The output power of the inverter will be only supplied and restricted by the load, and nothing will go back to the grid. The third option is power limited grid connection. The grid connection point can have a limited output power exported back, and that's by setting the parameters from the FusionSolar app. In the next slides, we will see how these settings are being controlled. First point, grid connection with zero power. So here we have the closed loop controller. Closed loop controller can either be the inverter directly, if it's direct connection with the inverter, between the inverter and the power sensor. And for multiple inverters, we can have the closed loop controller, either the smart dongle or the smart logger. So once clicking on the grid connected point with zero power, the inverter power will be regulated according to the load. So here we have an example of a 5 kilowatt inverter. Let's say if the load is 6 kilowatt, so it will supply the 5, and in this case we can import from the grid. So the power sensor will be observing and monitoring the consumption of the load and will send signals to the inverter to regulate the output. In case it's exceeding the inverter maximum output, then we will import power from the grid. In case if it's less than the inverter output, so the inverter output will be decreased to meet the capacity or the consumption of the load. So here the 5 kilowatt inverter is reduced to 3 kilowatt production and zero power is exported back to the grid. And for using this function, it's a must to have a power sensor. This function can be enabled and disabled using the FusionSolar application. Next, in the scenario, we have the zero export control setting. We have two options, whether the total power limit or based on the single phase. For the total power limit, the inverter will sum the total load on the 3 phases and will supply power equally distributed between those loads. So for example, here in the total power limit scenario, the load accumulation is 6 kilowatt. So the inverter will provide 6 kilowatt. Third of the power will go to each load phase. So we will have 2 kilowatt for the first phase, 2 kilowatt for the second phase, and 2 kilowatt for the third phase. If the first phase consumption is less, then the inverter will be exporting 1 kilowatt in the normal scenarios, but here it will be reduced as well because of the zero export function. So the total of the power consumption will be 0. The second phase, we will have 2 kilowatt of consumption against 2 kilowatt of production. So 0 is exported back to the grid. And the third one, we have 2 kilowatt of production and 3 kilowatt of consumption. So this actually will go back to the load that is requiring more production or more input. So the total power exported back to the grid will be 0. The control will be done within the phases load and the inverter phases production. In case of single phase limit, for the single phase limit, the inverter will produce power based on the smallest load on that phase. So for example, here we have 3 phases and the smallest load is 1 kilowatt. So the inverter will supply equally 1 kilowatt to each phase in case we are using the single phase power. So each phase will get 1 kilowatt regardless of the consumption of the other phases. So in these cases, we have higher consumption in phase number 2 and phase number 3. So we will be importing power from the grid to the load. But again, nothing will be exported back to the grid. So we have those two modes to control the zero export. Nothing will be going back to the grid. The control will be done between the inverter and the loads. Here we can see the response time settings of the zero export control. As I mentioned earlier, with the single phase, it takes 2 seconds to respond to the variation in the power output. With multiple inverters with WLAN FE and 4G, it takes 5 seconds between observing the high inverter output and observing the low load consumption and directly regulating the output based on the load. So it will happen within 5 seconds. And for multiple inverters with a smart logger, it will be done within 2 seconds. The other option is limited power at the grid connection point. So in this case, instead of using zero export back to the grid, in some locations, the grid operator allows, for example, 20% power to be exported back or 30%, and setting certain amount of power that can be exported back. So for this scenario, we can see what are the available options. Number one, inverter output power adjustment. So we can adjust actually the inverter output power and cap it at a certain limit. And this scenario does not require a power meter in this case. It can be done using the FusionSolar app. We will go to the home page after connecting with the inverter WLAN. In the home page, we can see power adjustments. We click on the active power control and then click on active power output option. And we can click and select to adjust the inverter output power. So for example, if an inverter is rated at 20 kilowatt and the grid operator or the client wants us to reduce the output of the inverter, for example, to 15 kilowatt. So we can set the exact value that the inverter will not exceed the 15 kilowatt in that case. And this does not require any power meter because this is the internal inverter power capping method. Now we can see the control of the active power. As I mentioned, it can be either done by the percentage, so the inverter output can be derated by the percentage. For example, at 50% for a 6 KTL inverter, it gives us a maximum power output of 6.6. If we set the output power to be derated by 50%, then the inverter will generate 3.3 kilowatt only. It will generate 50% of the output power, maximum output power. There's another option that we can also reduce it to a fixed value. So for example, we have a 6 KTL inverter. We want the output not to exceed a 3 kilowatt. So we can click on the option derated by fixed active power, and then we put the value. So the maximum will not exceed the value that we have assigned or selected. So in this case, for a 6.6 kilowatt maximum output, we can set it to be 3 kilowatt, and that will feed our load. The extra will be exported back to the grid. And again, I'm talking about the adjustment of the inverter output in this case, and not the zero export. For zero export, we need to use the power sensor. So this scenario actually, it provides a very flexible design and very flexible option. So a 20 kilowatt inverter can be reduced and used at 18 kilowatt or 15 kilowatt, depending on the design requirement or the end user requirement. This function actually can be controlled and accessed using the FusionSolar application. We need to connect to the inverter directly and go to power adjustments and select or insert the power that we want to maintain the inverter at. In case if we are having multiple inverters, of course, they will have to be controlled by a dongle. And if they are above 10 units, then they would have to be controlled by a smart logger. And by this, actually, we have completed the active power control options. They are very easy and directly controlled by the mobile application. So for remote monitoring, in case if you want to observe the output of the system, you can observe the load consumption, you can observe the production, you can even observe the export back to the grid. So all of this can be done with the FusionSolar application by remote monitoring or through the online monitoring platform. But for changing the settings, it can only be done locally by the FusionSolar application. And it's protected with an installer password, which is 50A. So the client cannot change the settings. It can only be changed with the installer permit in this case, or by giving the client the installer password. This was a brief introduction to Huawei's power control options. For any further queries or project-related queries, please contact us directly on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com. We are open to clarify and provide more technical or in-depth materials based on the project-wise. You may reach us directly. For any sales inquiry, please join us by sending us emails on jbsolar.gulf@jubailibros.com. I'm now proceeding to the questions and answers sector. Please send me all the questions in the chat box. All of you will receive everyone will receive the slides on email. I'm sure our marketing team will be direct in touch with you after finishing today's webinar, and you will receive the slides. Now we're viewing the questions. If the inverter is 6 KTL inverter, how much extra power or kilowatt can be imported and handled by a 6 KTL inverter? So the 6 KTL inverter can provide you with 6.6 kilowatt maximum power output. And as I mentioned, it can be capped and based on the design requirement and the project settings. Moving to the next question. you wish to inquire options to become an authorized distributor, please email us directly on jbsolar.gulf@jubailibros.com for any sales and marketing related inquiries, and we will get back to you. Another question is, can we synchronize two different inverters of two different output powers like the 2 and the 5 kilowatt? Yes, of course. We can synchronize two inverters, we can synchronize 10, and we can synchronize up to 80, as I mentioned in the first slides. So if you're having a 2 and a 5 kilowatt inverter, you can connect them together and connect an RS-485 communication cable between them. You will choose one of them as the master inverter. You will connect it to the smart power sensor by RS-485, and you will connect the smart dongle 4G or WLAN FE to communicate with both inverters. So in case of the power limitation or the zero export function is enabled, the signals will be sent to both inverters. So both of them will reduce their power output to achieve the maximum power required by the load at that time. So let's say your load becomes only 5. So your 5 kilowatt inverter, for example, will reduce to 4, and your 2 kilowatt will reduce to 1. That's an example. And the total will be only equal to your 5 kilowatt load consumption. How much maximum PV panels? Just a second, I'm viewing the questions from the chat box to the screen. Okay. Any other make of zero export device will support Huawei inverters. So as I mentioned, for the zero export scenarios, we have Huawei single phase and three phase inverters that can, for the three phase power sensor, can accommodate up to 170 kilowatt solar system. For systems bigger than that capacity, you can use third-party power meters, which are already tested and approved by Huawei. And please communicate with me on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com for more details or for getting this approved meters list from us. What is the rated output power efficiency of the inverter? Actually, it varies. For the residential scale, it can be up to 98.4 or 98.6. For the commercial scale, it can be 98.7 and so on. So it's different from a model to a model. For the utility scale, nowadays, we are reaching up to 99.3%. So it's different from a model to another. Please send us an email as per the model that you require, and we can send you the technical data sheets. Can one be able to generate a printable output performance report for a particular site from the application? Yes, for sure. So Huawei has an online monitoring platform that can be accessed from PC or laptop or any device. And on the online monitoring platform, you can actually perform IV curve diagnosis and for the operational maintenance purposes. And as a daily use or an hourly data, you can see the hourly data of each plant on this management platform. The login and the registration for this platform is free. We can create an account for you, being the value-added partner of Huawei. If you have existing plans that you want to add to your system or to the account, please email us on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com. I will support you with creating the plant and create an account for you if you don't have an account yet. Next question. Does the inverter come with a built-in charge controller? So I'm not sure which inverter are you referring to, but the inverter have built-in MPPT. So it's a maximum power point tracker for the DC section of the inverter. So it maximizes the output power for the string, it enhances the yield, and it always tracks the maximum power point in the uh, IV curve of the panels. So therefore, it enhances the yield by at least 1.56% per string. Can I regulate the other inverter with FusionSolar device? If you are referring to the FusionSolar application, yes, you can. If you are connecting to one inverter and performing zero export or power limitation on one inverter, and you have another inverter connected to it with RS485, so with using a dongle, you can communicate with both inverters, and whatever function that you apply on the first inverter will be also applied on the second inverter, as long as they are cascaded as well and communication is set between both of them. Does the inverter come with a built-in charge controller? I believe I have already explained that. Can we connect Arduino controller with a smart logger 3000A? Mirza, can you clarify further about your question? Please clarify further, and what is the feature or the function that you are trying to reach to? Vinod, is there any device supplies or recommended by Huawei for checking the string, voltage, current, resistance, line, Seaward PV200? Actually, Huawei, you can actually observe all of these features and all of these outputs and specifications through Huawei inverters, if you are using Huawei inverter. So by directly communicating with the application and connecting to the inverter, you can see the string voltage and the string current and all the details about each and every string, actually. So it does string level monitoring. So if you are referring to the perhaps power meters or ammeters, sorry, on voltmeters, they are not, we don't have a recommended list. They are irrespective of the brand, of course. Valentine, the FusionSolar app, I cannot trace the power adjustment function. Actually, you can trace it from the application. You need to log into the main page and you click on power adjustment function. Please communicate with me directly on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com, and we can set up a session if you have an ongoing project and help you with the configuration. But it's there on the home page. You can click on power adjustment function and yes, perform settings on the parameters that you require. I'm sorry, Mirza, I'm not understanding your question, but it's not connected. So can I connect Arduino controller with Smart Logger 3000A? If you can explain to me further, what are you trying to achieve with this Arduino controller, that will be great. Then I can help you or clarify further on the eligibility. With the string output monitoring, does it require installation of optimizer, or there are special devices that come along with the inverter? Actually, Huawei inverters are very smart, so they do perform string output monitoring without any additional devices. The optimizers are only used for the module monitoring level. So for example, for the small residential scale of inverters, the inverter already shows you the output per string, the voltage, the current, and so on, and if there's any fault in this string. But if you want to perform monitoring based on a panel level or module level, then yes, you will have to use the full optimizer. What is the maximum distance of the communication cable for the inverters? So if you are using the RS485 communication cable, if you're using the M-bus, it can be up to 1,000 meters. With the it can be up to 1,000 meters with the RS485 cable from the last inverter, and it can be 300 meters if you are using a single core AC cable with the M-bus communication, and 500 meters if you are using a 4-core cable with the M-bus communication. Can we control the active power if the load is not balanced on the 3 phases? Yes, of course. For Israel Oido, yes, you can control the active power of the inverter because you will control the total active power out of the inverter. So it's regardless of if the load are not balanced. So let's say, for example, if you have a load that is higher than the other loads in the other phases, then you can import the difference, the additional difference from the grid side. Otherwise, the active power output from the inverter will be distributed equally on all the 3 phases. Muhammad Haroon, can we control the active power if the load is not balanced on the 3 phases? Yes. Is there any privilege to balance or stop individual phase current? The only privilege, for example, if you are you don't want to import anything from the grid, you want your inverter, for example, to be your system to be sufficiently reliable on the inverter output. So basically the inverter output will be distributed between 3 phases equally. So if I have a 6 kilowatt inverter, I will have 2 kilowatt per load. So if I have non-balanced load, like 1 kilowatt on one phase and the other phase has 3 and this third phase has like 5 or 6 kilowatt, so the inverter regardless will be providing power with equal balance between the loads. So if the power is not balanced between, if the loads are not balanced, so some of the loads you may have to import power from the grid side if they are higher than the other phases. Those Huawei inverters, hybrid inverters, synchronize with the generator once the grid side has a blackout. Does this involve using a PV diesel hybrid controller? Yes, for sure, Valentine. You must have a PV diesel hybrid controller when using Huawei inverters with a generator. So the PV controller will communicate with the inverters, will communicate with the controller of your generator, and will control and balance the power sources output. And the power, actually the hybrid controller will, yes, it will operate and start the generator when the grid is out or having a blackout, maybe during the evening time. So the hybrid controller, you will set all the required settings and it will be controlling the output of the 3 power sources. The aim is to stop export on the unbalanced load. Distribution for all phases. I'm sorry, can you rephrase that? So basically, even if your load is not balanced, for example, you can either, you can use the total power option for the active power, for the zero export control. There's an option of the total power control. So the total power, once you click on that, if your inverter is sufficient for the load, So even if the loads are imbalanced also, as long as the inverter capacity is designed as per the load requirement. So in case if there's a load that is not balanced, the inverter will send the extra or additional output, and it will be reflected back to the less, let's say, less loaded load or load phase. So for example, like the previous, let me just go back to the presentation. If you can see this scenario. So here the loads are imbalanced. We have one of them at 1, the other is at 2, and the third is at 3. The inverter, regardless, will supply equal power at each load. So the inverter will have 6/3 phases, then it will be 2 kilowatt per phase supplied. If these two are imbalanced, so the additional power exported will go back here, and again will go back to the load phase that requires higher capacity. So your total power exported to the grid side will be 0. So the full control will happen between the inverter output and the phases of the loads. So whatever is extra will go back to the load that requires more output. Going back to the questions and answers. What? Can I regulate inverters? Sorry. From Zishan, can I regulate the other inverters with FusionSolar device? Yes, you can. You can regulate the output of the other connected inverters from the master inverter using the power sensor and the dongle, or the power sensor and the smart logger. So you can control the other devices' output as well. What are the precautions to observe when connecting multiple inverters? So when you are connecting multiple inverters with the zero export, for example, or the active power control mode, you have to be cautious and pay attention to the communication cable connected between them. Because if the communication cable is not connected well, for example, to one of the inverters, it will not get the signals. And this will create the confusion between the full daisy chain. So that's the main point, that in multiple inverter scenario, basically the power sensor will send the signals to the master unit, and the master unit will reflect the signal to the remaining units. From Ramondo, besides the other communication features, can you take us more on the Bluetooth features and settings if available? So the Bluetooth feature is mostly available using the Bluetooth USB tool with the bigger commercial and industrial range of inverters. As we know, Huawei, smaller range of inverters from 2 kilowatt up to 30 and 40 kilowatt, they do have built-in WLAN. Okay, and they are compatible with the 4G and the WLAN dongles. But for the bigger inverters, started from the 50 and 60 up to the 200 KTL, they don't have built-in WLAN. That's why they come with a USB tool, whether a Bluetooth USB adapter or the WLAN USB adapter. So this Bluetooth feature can connect with your phone in order to access the inverter with the FusionSolar app. Can we connect a single power sensor or two or more to two or more than two inverters? Yes, of course. So single phase power sensor will work with single-phase inverters. So you just need to make sure that your inverters are single-phase inverters, and the output is single-phase, and so on. What are, sorry. Would you please share us a real project that uses this system? Hamid, please communicate with us on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com, and I can share with you reference of projects with this zero export power features already done and executed. There is a list of reference of the projects. I want to connect RainWise RainGauge with Smart Logger. Definitely you can do that. First of all, the Smart Logger has a list of the approved power sensors and list of approved EMI. So approved weather stations and approved sensors. But first you have to check that the exact model that you require is compatible with the Smart Logger. You can communicate with me directly on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com, and I will be able to share with you the approved list of weather stations and how do you configure them with the Smart Logger. Yes, Mirza, RainWise is compatible with the Smart Logger. If you're having an issue, please communicate with us directly on technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com, and we will guide you to solve the issue. Can we control? Okay, I believe I already responded to Mahmoud. Can you please confirm what is the installer code for the FusionSolar app? So the installer code to connect with the inverter, so it has a safety password, it's 508. Whenever you are connecting to the inverter WLAN or the Bluetooth for the bigger range of inverters, which is now also replaced by a WLAN tool, the password is 508. Please send me a voice and video of a complete file. Definitely, Noman. We will send you the presentation right after the webinar. You will receive it on your registered email. Inverters which are not single phase. They are 3-phase on-grid inverters. Sorry, Mahmoud, Mohammed, can you please explain further your question? What is the function of the Logger 3000A integrated with Huawei inverters? So the Smart Logger 3000A, it's a data logger. It converges ports and protocols. It has multiple input ports. It has different interfaces. It communicates with the devices from the solar system. It centrally monitors all the output of the solar system and send it to the FusionSolar platform for monitoring. Okay, everyone, thank you for attending. Our time is finished for today's webinar. I hope you have enjoyed it. Please send us an email to technicalsolar.uae@jubailibros.com for any technical issues or technical queries, technical clarifications, and we will get back to you immediately. Thank you very much.